Everything you add to the truth subtracts from the truth. Echoing that laconic wisdom our ancestors seem to so clearly grasp and understand, and illustrating the path taken by these false wise men, these sophists and magicians and spinners of words, as they created layer after layer of their own wildly subjective and speculative intellectual musings atop a far more pure and simple tradition. And once again, I think etymology holds some clues here. We often use the word wholesome, and it's a truly great word to describe deeply positive and healthy things. Whole and wholeness represent totality in balance, completion. The word holistic is similar. And, of course, the word holy. Absolute truth, the highest truth, is expressed in this whole, a seeking to glimpse, grasp, and understand the totality to the best of our limited and fallible abilities. Reductionist science represents an attempt to cobble together a sprawling picture of the most technical minutiae of our existence, seemingly believing that this sprawling data or knowledge picture might then sufficiently explain our reality. But this seems a bit like believing you might understand a great movie by reading the script, or a sporting event by looking at the box score, or a masterful painting by examining it with a microscope. Facts are merely cold and clinical little data points. Everything valuable, everything interesting, and everything of great worth seems to exist above and beyond them, the as yet unknowable connective tissue. What seems to have originated so long ago as a caste of men who purposefully lived austere lives of self-sacrifice, devoting themselves to the task of attaining a deeper understanding of our world in order to positively guide and shape it, had everywhere devolved into something very different. Instead of serving God and the people, they found ingenious methods to become the gods of the people and make them their slaves. I'm reminded of the quote from Rabbi WWII WWII, essentially stating that others were born to serve them, or the similar rabbinical statements indicating that a future goal is outright enslavement. And they're not alone here. Jesuit and Masonic orders, several prominent and likely interconnected secret societies, the Vatican, all seem to epitomize the bad shepherd, and seem to seek a future in which their dominance and control is complete and unquestionable, and one in which natural and higher law might be fully transgressed whenever it suits their aims. It may even be fair to say that this very transgression is their aim. I think it's noteworthy that Reuben Burrow, who I quoted earlier, rejected the possibility that the Druids had been killed and their knowledge lost, suggesting that, quote, it is much more likely that they turned schoolmasters and Freemasons and fortune-tellers, end quote. Examine the political, ideological, and philosophical leanings of these groups, and you'll find virtually no conflict between them. You'll also find that they're all increasingly backing a singular religion, though they'll never call it by that word, intended to operate above and beyond all others. The religion of science. Modern science, ironically operating from the greatest of all faith-based conceptions, in its insistence that there definitively exists no creator or higher power, subsequently masquerades as this ultimate authority itself, with its direct equivalents of druids and rabbis and magi's as the self-professed expert class, a class which seems to have completely and utterly lost its connection to the source, marching about like self-important children, wearing their parents' clothes, making definitive and declaratory judgments everywhere they go, and yet failing miserably time and time and time again. They're utterly lost, and because they're the governing force in our world, they threaten to drag the rest of us with them. A degenerated tradition, degraded very nearly beyond any hope of repair. Many still think of science as if it's a tireless and objective pursuit of truth, of reliable and trustworthy data and information on which we might build a better and clearer understanding of our world. And there were periods of history in which it seemed to be something approximating this. Europe, prior to the World Wars, seems an excellent example. The most brilliant minds in the world, devoted to discovering new plant and animal species and understanding their attributes, exploring and exhaustively studying our oceans and skies. Many true geniuses with boundless curiosity and self-discipline enough to not overstep or take wild leaps, but to move forward in a sober, disciplined, apolitical manner. These were true intellectuals, a descriptor that once meant something real, and I believe this was a period of true progress, yet another word that has been made all but meaningless, with regard to furthering our understanding of the world around us. As the forces of international banking and finance triumphed in these world wars, and as they instituted their central banks and the Federal Reserve, and began controlling and printing the pieces of paper nearly every man, woman, and child on the planet strives to earn and spend, the institutions of science, like every other meaningful or powerful or influential institution, began to gradually change shape and become something very different. For the first time since the inception of universities and colleges, their doors are now wide open to the most mediocre minds, and merit itself has ceased to be a yardstick almost entirely. They've become credential mills, whose foremost requirement is that the individual believes what these hidden hands of our new status quo want them to believe, that they're willing to act as dutiful apostles for this new dogma. Science, accordingly, has gone from fascinating and thought-provoking studies, including those speaking to the differences between races, cultures, nations, or genders, to, quote, proving race doesn't exist, proving gender doesn't exist, proving that Western culture and mankind are responsible for the ills of the world, that COVID is a rampaging and deadly pandemic, that vaccines and masks will prevent contracting or spreading the disease. In short, science can now, quote, prove virtually anything. In a world now overflowing with information, with an uncountable number of possible data points to pull from to make one's case, it's as simple as finding the handful that paint the idea one wishes to sell in the best light, and then weaving them together in an attractive and compelling manner. Science is now the malleable, adaptable chameleon that now only masquerades as a coldly logical, rational, hard-nosed, and unswerving seeker of truth. In an environment in which belief in a creator has been slowly but surely torn to shreds, and perhaps even more importantly, painted in a negative, shameful light more often than not, that subset of the public seeking to be seen as fashionable or intelligent or well-educated can't help but naturally and instinctively flock to this new dogma, this new faith-based religion, which so effectively and dishonestly pretends to be above leaps of faith, above those silly, ignorant, backward people with the nerve to hold beliefs similar to those of essentially every single great genius across every single generation that came before us. For what it's worth, I propose that this masterful sleight of hand is essentially an act of magic. And as with any good magician, the trick only retains its immense power when the observer doesn't know how it's done. Illusion, deception, manipulation, and subterfuge. These are the hallmarks of our modern-day magi, who've refined their dark art over the generations to such a degree that the vast majority of their handiwork even still remains unnoticed, behind screens of puppets, fronts, masks, all the while using every means at their disposal to maintain control over the incentivization and punishment structure, broadly speaking, to take full advantage of an atomized public, increasingly seeking their own immediate self-interest, lured into slumber by bread and circuses. The French Revolution marked one of many major turning points, setting the stage for the sickly environment we face today. The rallying and stoking of the mob into a maddened, murderous rage before pointing them toward the ancient nobility and aristocracy to utterly decimate their ranks. Or Cromwell in England, or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the brutal murder of the entire Romanov line to settle an ancient score. These movements that took such pains to portray themselves as populist people's movements against oppressive elites, in actuality functioned as the means to open the door for something far, far darker. For decades, we've been bombarded with horror stories about the dangers of the, quote, strongman, or of monarchy. And those victors, authoring the history books, have sought to portray these men and their forms of government as the root of all evil. Meanwhile, near absolute power has everywhere been transferred from these patriarchs and their descendants, and into the hands of banking families and their dutiful little army of collaborators and bought men, behind the mask of lofty notions like democracy or capitalism or equal representation, facades of fairness and justice, Moloch and Mammon in a mask. I spoke in a previous video about how races, cultures, or nations essentially shape themselves over time, like manifested archetypal representations of the collective, fostering and cultivating their own unique set of strengths and weaknesses, unique spheres of dominance or blind spots. I'd ask you to entertain the possibility of a unique culture of individuals who now represent the end product of an intergenerational Machiavellian self-authoring of sorts, in which they're not striving to be the most intelligent or creative and artistic, inventive or otherwise capable, not seeking to better the world or find ways to make it more organized, stable, secure, happy, or healthy, but rather focusing entirely, exclusively, solely on obtaining a dominant position by any means necessary. Let's even pretend, for the sake of argument, that such a collective group or culture didn't exist, but rather only individuals of this type existed, here and there, scattered throughout the world. Do you think such types might eventually find one another, might find common cause and common ground, form alliances, and begin to quietly work with each other toward common goals? And if this occurred, do you think you would know? There's a reason great men have always found secrecy, especially on the world stage or with regard to politics, to be repugnant. Conspiracies are inherently dishonest, and no leader who loves his people would have reason to lurk in the shadows or seek to break in through the back door. Such men would have nothing to hide, because their intentions are pure, simple, and straightforward. Our current power brokers found creative ways to slaughter entire generations of such men, their families, supporters, and ideological and cultural kin. In the 2 world wars, millions of courageous and principled men were robbed of their very existence, their blood turned into fertilizer in the fields of Europe, while the coffers of these men lurking in the shadows exploded. Proceeds they then used, in part, to bring to power a new, more tame and more domesticated and domesticatable type of mankind, and thus incrementally and slowly but surely the noose tightened ever further. So were the Magi, the Druids, the Brahmin, and similar orders good or bad? Seems to me a question impossible to answer, because I think it's the wrong question, and a flawed question, because they haven't been a static, unchanging entity across time. A more informative question might be, how have they changed, morphed, and evolved over the millennia? And does our modern priestly or teacher caste now bear any resemblance to those lofty figures from the dawn of human history? Or might we be dealing with imposters, a purposefully subverted and consciously degenerated and degraded tradition, opening the door for the covert rule of a type of mankind that could never attain or retain such absolute power in the transparent light of day? Has our distracted negligence and inattention allowed dark magicians to grasp the reins? And if so, is there still enough light in the world to truly banish this darkness and unseat them?